Hello. Let's talk about chapter 16. The final chapters of 1st Nephi take us from Lehi's family's journey in the wilderness through their journey across the seas to the promised land until they reach Bountiful. The chapters talk about the trials, the spiritual, emotional, and physical trials that they experience, their tests of faith, and shows how God leads them constantly when they were faithful to Him. Last chapter ended with Nephi chastising his brothers about their behavior, and we see now that they complain about it, saying that you have said such hard things to us, things that are difficult for us to accept. And Nephi replies, saying that he has spoken hard things about people who are being wicked, going against the truth of God, and that he has spoken up for the righteous choices, reminding them that the ones who make righteous choices will be saved at the end. He also tells them that only the guilty people, the people who struggle with knowing that their choices are wrong, find the truth hard because it points to them how they are wrong. He then tells his brothers that if they were righteous and willing to listen to the truth, they could stand comfortably before God. They wouldn't have an issue with what Nephi, had said about wickedness. Ponder this. Think of a time when pride has stopped you from doing something you knew could be possibly right because someone else told you to do it. We all do this at some point or the other. We're so caught up in thinking that we're in the right that we don't even consider the possibility of any other point of view. And we often get angry with anyone else who tries to guide us, even when they have more experience or knowledge about a situation than us. Nephi stresses again to his brothers the importance of following God's commandments until they realize their wrongdoings and they turn to God again. And this gives Nephi much joy. And then Nephi talks about him marrying one of the daughters of Ishmael and his brothers and Zoram also marrying the daughters of Ishmael. Nephi stresses how exceedingly blessed he feels with his life. Ponder this. Stop and consider how blessed you are right now, today. Think of all that you have. Think of all that God has blessed you with. The comfort, the support, and the love you feel and experience from Him daily. Acknowledge just how much God has blessed you when you pray today. And then Nephi tells us that in his son's marrying, Lehi has finished all the commandments of God that God had given him to do up to then. After this, Nephi says that the voice of the Lord spoke to Nephi in a dream at night and told him that he should pack up and resume his journey into the wilderness again. And the next day, Lehi woke up, and when he went to the door of his tent and opened it, he saw a round ball made of brass with an unusual look and design to anything he had ever seen before. Inside that ball, there were 2 needles, and one needle pointed the way that the Lord wanted them to go. Ponder this. Can you imagine how Lehi felt looking at what we know today is the liahona on the ground in front of him, knowing that it had not been there when he went to sleep the previous night? What do you think the thoughts that he had were? How do you recognize God showing you which direction He wants you to go in? How do you react to it, especially when it seems unfamiliar and unexpected? Think about how the liahona worked. It only worked in response to Lehi's family having faith in God and following His advice. The minute they stopped listening to it or they started murmuring, the liahona would not work. The other interesting thing is that we know that the liahona was a small and a temporal thing, something that was ordinary looking and simple, not something that looked magical or outwardly. Revelation often comes the same way from God. The voice of the Lord or the voice of Spirit is usually very soft. It's very easy to miss and to ignore unless you were faithfully waiting for it or expecting it to come. Sometimes, very often, most often, it isn't even a voice, it's a feeling that you have. And unless you're looking for it, unless you're expecting it, it's very easy to ignore. Each of us have our own compass or liahona, our own conscience that is given to us by God to guide us if we listen to it regularly. And Lehi and his family gathered all their things together, packed up their provisions in their tents, along with a collection of seeds so that they could grow crops in the new land, and they went into the wilderness after crossing the river Laman. And they traveled for 4 days in a south-southwest direction till they pitched their tents again, and they called this place Shazer. And then they took their bows and arrows and they went into the wilderness to find food for their families. And once they slayed the animals they had found, they returned back to their families with the fresh food. And they went out again the same way, being guided into the most fertile parts of the wilderness by the Lord, who sent them where He knew they would find food. And then they traveled for many days, hunting food on the way with their bows and arrows and their slings and stones. following the direction the needle on the liahona pointed out to them. The needles on the compass led them through the most fertile places of the wilderness. If an area was fertile, it was likely that there was food to be found there. And after they had traveled for many days, they set up their tents again so that they could rest and gather strength again. Ponder this. When Lehi's family traveled in the wilderness, moving from one place to another, they didn't open up their tents and their supplies daily. They likely slept on bedrolls outside in the open, cooking under the open sky. Not an easy way to travel. When they decided to camp and open up their tents, they did so, but most of the time they were on the road. And then they were faced with another challenge. When Nephi went out hunting, he broke his bow, a bow that had been made of steel. And his family was very angry with him because they didn't end up getting any food to take back to camp because Nephi's bow was broken. This was a really difficult situation to deal with, as the other bows that his brothers had lost their springs and were not working either. So the families were hungry and tired already from their journeying, and when they went back with no food. And then again, Laman, Lemuel, and the sons of Ishmael began to grumble about their troubles and problems, wandering in the wilderness. And at this time, even Lehi started to grumble and murmur things against God, feeling sorry for themselves about the situation that they were all facing and experiencing. And Nephi also suffered along with the others because they couldn't get any food. But think about this. Nephi's reaction was very different to that of his family. Instead of murmuring himself, instead of grumbling and finding fault himself, he spoke to his family, telling them not to harden their hearts and complain about God or turn against God. And then Nephi went out there. He made himself a bow and arrow out of wood. He took a slingshot and he took stones to go and find food somehow. Ponder this. Look at the difference between the way the rest of the family reacted and the way Nephi reacted. Nephi still trusted in the Lord and found a solution. He took it upon himself to find a solution, to make a bow, unlike the others who sat and grumbled. Very often, when things go wrong, we sit there waiting for God to fix the situation for us. But unless we take action, we turn to Him, and then we go out there trying to find a solution ourselves, He can't help us. And then Nephi did one more amazing thing. He went to his father and said to him, "Where shall I go and get food, Father?" Now consider this carefully. Nephi knew that his father was undergoing a crisis of faith and self-belief. Lehi was pained at the fact that he had led his family into this situation and he was doubting himself. By Nephi going to Lehi and effectively telling him, reassuring him, "The Lord will tell you where to go, Father. Ask him where I should go and get food." Nephi gave that self-belief back to his father. Remember that belief comes after doing. And then Lehi asked the Lord, and the Lord spoke to him, and Lehi felt deep sorrow that he had murmured against the Lord. And the Lord told him to look at the liahona and see the things that were written on it to guide them. And then when Lehi and Nephi's brothers and the sons of Ishmael looked at the liahona and they saw the words written on it, they grew afraid and they knew that the Lord knew everything that had happened. And Nephi realized that the needles of the liahona worked only when we had belief. If they didn't believe, it didn't work. And the writings on the liahona changed constantly according to the faith and the commitment they had in following it. And then the writings told them what the Lord wanted them to do. We see how God works huge transformations and changes through small things. The liahona was a really small thing, but it worked huge miracle. And then Nephi was told to go up to the top of the mountain in a message on the liahona to find food. And he found and he killed many wild animals that he brought home for food. And when he came back to the tents carrying the food, his family was so happy and they thanked and they prayed to God for saving them. And after a while, they started traveling again. And after traveling for many days, they camped again to rest. And Ishmael died at this place, and he was buried in the place that they called Nahom. And the daughters of Ishmael mourned and were sad because of the loss of their father and because of the struggles in the wilderness. And they murmured and they grumbled about Lehi having brought them all the way from Jerusalem to struggle and die. And then they spoke about Lehi and about Nephi, and they wanted to return back to Jerusalem. And then again, Laman said to Lemuel and to the sons of Ishmael, "Let us kill our father Lehi and our brother Nephi, who tries to rule and lead us, his elder brothers." Laman influences the others to get angry with Nephi by telling them that Nephi says that the Lord has spoken to him and the angels ministered to him, but we know that he's lying. We know that he's cunning and deceiving and he's trying to fool us into doing these things so that he can rule over us. And at that point, the voice of the Lord spoke to them all. It rebuked them, it scolded them for their thoughts and talks. And after they had heard this, Laman, Lemuel, and the sons of Ishmael repented again and turned back to God to lead, to protect, and to feed them.